welcome to this latest video offering. If you like this video, then please hit the like button. If you want to comment, then please feel free to do so. If you want to share among friends, family, colleagues, anybody really, then please do. And if you want to get more great tech videos that are coming your way, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Now, let's get on with the video. Hi and welcome to this tutorial on IPv4 subnetworking, or in its shorter format known as subnetting. So what we want to do is we want to get into subnetting or subnetworking to try and give you an easy way to subnet in your head and give you a really good solid understanding of how binary functions and how we can do the mathematical equation between decimal and binary. So let's make it as simple as we can. So let's start here. So an IPv4 network address is comprised of 4 bytes separated into 4 blocks of 1 byte. So 1 byte in each block. Each byte is comprised of 8 bits. You've all heard the saying 8 bits in a byte. So a sample IPv4 address is shown below, 192.168.16.1. That is an IPv4 sample address. So the bits are written in binary and they're either on, which is a 1, or off, which is a 0. There's a subnet mask associated with all IPv4 network address ranges, or prefixes as they're sometimes known. There are private subnets and public subnets. There are also classful subnets and classless subnets, but we're going to go into that as we go through this lesson. We don't want to go into great depth right here on this, nor do we want to go in a huge amount of depth with regards to how we utilize this, because it'll cross boundaries into other great lessons, other great tech information to do with IPv4 that's coming your way. However, what we do want to do is we want to go into enough depth, as I've already stated, to ensure you have a clear understanding of networking and binary, even if you're a beginner or an experienced network engineer and just want a refresh. So let's start with the binary format itself, starting from the very beginning. As we already mentioned on the previous slide, IPv4 addresses are comprised of 4 bytes. As we also mentioned, each byte is comprised of 8 bits. Binary is either a 1 on or 0 off. The way we label it in decimal so that we have a better understanding and can do the mathematics required, this is how it would be seen. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to lay it out as all zeros. Don't worry about that at the moment. I just want to show you the bits and how we put a decimal value to those bits so that we can work out the actual addressing. So this would comprise of our 8 bits, which would form 1 byte. So starting from right to left, we just double it. We start at 1 and we double all the way up to 128. So our first bit from the right would be a 1, our second bit a 2, our third bit a 4, our fourth bit 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128. So the above example would represent just 1 byte of our 4 bytes in an IPv4 address. The below is how this would look for a complete 4 byte IPv4 address. Again, we're just going to utilize zeros in this example. So there's our 4 bytes, and there's how we would list that in binary underneath. This all looks quite complicated at the moment, but as we move through the lesson and start doing examples, you'll actually see that it's nowhere near as complicated as it looks here. So in the example, the top line is the decimal, And the bottom line is the binary version of zeros and ones, although here, as I've mentioned, we're just using all zeros for now. So now that we've covered the 8 bits per byte and how we utilise the binary and decimal, we now come on to the subject of, well, how are the ones and zeros utilised in the binary to decimal and vice versa conversion? Well, let's have a look at that. We're going to start with an understanding of what a 0 and a 1 signify in binary in its basic format. This is its basic format initially. So a 0 would be, it's not included because it's switched off. A 1, it is included because it's switched on. So that we can fully understand this, let's utilise the following IPv4 address as an example. So we're going to utilise 192.168.16.25, and we're going to have a look at how we use the zeros and ones to make up this address in binary. So we're going to use what we've already learned to complete this. So let's bring up our 4 bytes in bits. So we have our first block, dot second block, dot third block, dot fourth block. Okay, 192.168.16.25. So how do we work this out? Well, our first byte is 192. And all we simply do is we find out which one of these 8 sets of digits equals 192. And that's it. We turn those on and the others are left switched off. So let's look at 192. Does 128 go into 192? Yes, it does. So we turn that on. What about if we add 128 and 64 together? What do we get? Well, we actually get 192, which is what we're after. So that one is switched on. But because we've now equaled 192, we do not need to turn any of the others on. They can all remain off. So they will all become zeros. And that is the first byte dealt with. Now we come on to the second byte and it's exactly the same. 168. So what of these digits equals 168? Does 128 go into 168? Yes, it does. So we switch it on. 128 and 64, as we know, equals 192. Now that's greater than 168, so that cannot be switched on. So we put a 0. What about 128 and 32? What does that equal? Well, that actually equals 160, which is still below 168, so we can turn that one on. So we're now at 160 if we add those two together. What about if we add 16 to it? Well, that would give us 176, so that's too big, so we switch that off. What about if we add 8 to it? Well, that then gives us 168, which is exactly what we're after, so we switch that one on, which means the other 3 are not required and we leave them switched off. What about 16? Okay, well, we know it's under 128, so we can't switch that on. It's under 64, we can't switch that on. It's under 32, we can't switch that on. But it does equal 16, so we turn that one on. And we don't need any others, because 8, 4, 2 and 1 need to be switched off. So we switch those off. What about 25? Okay, again, 128 is too big, so we switch it off. 64, too big, so we switch it off. 32, too big, so we switch it off. 16 falls within it, so we're going to turn that one on. What about 16 plus 8? What does that give us? 24. That fits in there as well. What about if we add the 4? Well, that gives us 28. That's too much because we want the 25, so we turn it off. What about 24 plus 2? Well, that gives us 26. One too many. Switched off. What about the 1? Well, that gives us our 25. So if we were to look at that, we can write the IPv4 address 192.168.16.25 in binary as 11000000 .0.01000.000.000.0001100.1. So you can see how easy this is once you understand the binary side. Now we're going to take a look at classful network addressing. So we're going to have a look at the classful address ranges, their benefits, and their limitations. So IPv4 is divided into 5 classes of addressing. However, although I'm going to list all 5 below and their uses, we'll actually only be concentrating on the first 3 classes of A, B and C, because those are designed for hosts. So we'll have a look at those 3 in great detail, but here's the list of 5. So we have a class A. This utilises the first byte, 8 bits, or an octet as it's known, for the network, and the following 3 bytes are reserved for host addressing. Class B, well, this utilises the first 2 bytes, or the first 16 bits for the network, and the remaining 2 bytes for host addresses. A Class C, this utilises the first 3 bytes, or 24 bits for the network, and the remaining 1 byte for host addresses. Class D, that's actually reserved for multicast usage. When we do the tutorials on multicast itself, we'll delve into this in great depth. And Class E, that's reserved for future usage. So what we're going to do is on the next slides, we'll go through each class and the masks that are used for these classes in the subnetting. So let's go through the actual address ranges that are associated with each class, and we'll start with Class A. So what is the IPv4 Class A range of addresses? Well, there we go. It's 0000 through to 127.255.255.255. What's the Class B range of addresses? It's 128.0.0.0 through to 191.255.255.255. And Class C is 192.0.0.0 through to 223.255.255.255. Now I'm going to include the multicast here, even though we're not going to really concentrate on that within this lesson, just so that you know the range. So for the Class D, which is the multicast, it's 224.0.0.0 through to 239.255.255.255. Within these ranges, or these address ranges per class, we also have reserved private address ranges. So let's have a look at what those are and an explanation of them and why they're required. So private address ranges are for internal use only and are not allowed to be made available publicly. By this, what I'm actually describing here is that they wouldn't be allowed for external public accessibility, for example, the internet. In other words, where your own company or your private organisation, anybody else can get at it. Okay, we don't want that. So the reason the private address ranges were actually set aside was because at the time IPv4 address space was running low and actually would have soon expired, and it actually has expired now. These private ranges can be utilised by anyone or any company at any time. In other words, what I'm actually saying here is the same IPv4 private address that you might be using for a host or network could actually be being utilised by thousands of other companies or thousands of other people around the world at exactly the same point in time. And therefore, the IPv4 private ranges can never run out. The public ones can, the private ones cannot. So what are the actual ranges within the classes that are reserved for private use? So let's have a look at the Class A range of private addresses. So it goes from 10.0.0.0 through to 10.255.255.255. The Class B range of private addresses goes from 172.16.0.0 through to 172.31.255.255. And the Class C is 192.168.0.0 through to 192.168.255.255. We're now going to concentrate on how we use network masks to tell our systems what part of the IPv4 address is our network and what part of our IPv4 address is for our hosts. In other words, PCs, servers, printers, etc. Now, it is important that you have a firm grasp and understanding of this section and of binary. If you don't and you want to ask me any questions in the comments section, then please do, and I'll do my very best to answer them for you. So let's start with a Class A network and host address, and we're going to see how the network mask functions. So the address that we'll look at is 10.0.0.16/8. The /8 signifies that we are masking the first 8 bits. In other words, the first octet or the first byte. And it's always 255. What do we mean by 255? Well, do you remember our binary from earlier in this lesson? I hope you do, with the ones and the zeros. So we must ensure, though, that we don't at this point get confused with the actual IPv4 address in binary and the subnet mask. They are different, but the same. And I'll explain that as we continue. So here's how we would write the subnet mask for the above address in binary and decimal. So you remember in our previous lesson, we said that anything with a 1 under it needs to be included and added together, and anything with a 0 doesn't. So if we were to add all these ones, you remember it was 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. If we add those together, we get 255. And that's why we say this /8 or the first 8 bits. And why in decimal it would be written as 255.0.0.0 as the subnet mask. With a mask, the 1 means the number must be matched exactly, and this determines the network address. So in the example we're using here, the 1s are telling us that every host in this network must start with 10 in the first byte. So our network here is 10. Our hosts can be anything from 0, 0, 1, all the way through to 10, 255, 255, 254. 255 I will explain later with regards to that. But do you see now with a Class A how we separate the network from the host? Everything that's highlighted in green here is the network. Anything else beyond that is the host address. And as you can see, we can have millions of hosts. As we come across further, we get more networks, less hosts. But we will see that with the Class B and the Class C. But this is how we determine the network in a Class A with this 255.0.0.0. And you may hear it said in the workplace or somewhere else where they will say /8 or 255.0.0.0, and as it says here, they both mean the same thing. Now we're going to have a look at a Class B network and the host addresses and see how the network mask functions. So we're going to take the address 172.16.0.20. This is a host address with a /16. So in the above example, as per with the Class A, it was the first 8 bits, but in a Class B, it's the first 16 bits that signifies we're masking them. So that would be the first 2 octets, and again, it's always a 255. So in binary, we would write the first 8 bits as ones, the second 8 bits as ones. That's the network portion. And the second 2 bytes will be zeros, and that will be the host portion. So in decimal, we would write that as 255.255.0.0 as the subnet mask. Again, as with the Class A addressing, anything with a 1 must match explicitly. So, in the above example, any host on this network must have the first 2 bytes as 172.16. Okay, that's this section here. In the binary side of things, that would equal the first byte being ones, the second byte being ones, so the first 16 bits. Also, again, if we say /16 or 255.255.0.0, they both mean the same thing, that the first 16 bits are masked for the network. As per with the Class A address, the first host will begin with a 1. Now, what we mean by that is that the first available address in this network will be 172.16.0.1. So you note that it has to start with 172.16. Okay, that's the first available address is 0.1 within that 172.16 network. Now, as we go through this tutorial, we'll see how we work out the networks and the last host address. But for now, what I need is for you to concentrate on getting an understanding of the classes and how we actually mask the network portion. Now let's take a look at the Class C network and host addresses and see how the network mask functions. So we're going to take the IPv4 address of 192.168.1.20 with a /24. In the above example, the /24 signifies that we are masking the first 24 bits. That would be the first 3 octets, and again, it's always a 255. So in binary, we write the first octet or the first 8 bits as ones, the second octet or the second 8 bits as ones, and the third octet or third 8 bits as ones, and the fourth octet is zeros. In decimal, we write this as 255.255.255.0. Again, as with the Class A and the Class B addressing, anything with a 1 must match explicitly. So in the above example, any host on this network must have the first 3 bytes as 192.168.1. Also, as per with the Class A and Class B, if we say a /, in this case a /24 or 255.255.255.0, they both mean the same thing, that the first 24 bits are masked for the network portion. As per with Class A and Class B addresses, the first host will begin with a 1. So again, what we mean by that is that the first available address in this network will be 192.168.1.1. On the next slides, we're going to show you why Classful addressing is a quick and easy method to use, but also it has some downsides, and it's quite a significant downside, as we will see. But before we move on to that, if you need to refresh yourself, please do so, because now it gets a little bit more complicated. But we will try and make it as easy as we possibly can for you. So classful addressing is actually very straightforward, as all we need to do is utilize one of the following three for the masks, as we've already noted. So this is a little bit of a recap, really. So the class A, which is a 255.0.0.0, and what that gives us is a large range of host addresses, hence the 24 binary bits available to us for host addressing. However, that does compromise the amount of networks. So we have few networks, but a large amount of hosts per network. Then we have the class B, and that's 255.255.0.0. Now that gives us an equal amount of network address ranges as it does host addresses. So we have a medium range of host addresses, but more network addressing is available than a class A. Then we move to a class C. A class C gives us a small range of host addresses because we only have the last 8 bits, but significantly more network address ranges are available. So for this subnet section, we're going to work initially with a class C network range, as we're only working with the last 8 bits, and therefore it's the easiest to do the calculations on. Not that the calculations are complicated, as you'll see anyway. So let's look at the following network range: 192.168.1.0/24. So our network, because it's the 24 bits that are masked, the first 24, our network is going to be 192.168.1. The actual network address is known as 192.168.1.0. So we know the first 24 bits are masked for the network address, which leaves us 8 bits available for hosts, as we can see below. So if we look at it in binary, the network portion is here, the host portion is here. So decimal, as we've already stated above, that's 255.255.255.0. So this is our network portion, and this is our host portion in the decimal. So the first available address would be 192.168.1.1, because remember, we have to explicitly have the first 3 bytes as this 192.168.1 address. And we can see this in binary as we start from the right and work to the left. So we have our network, we have our host portion, and we have our first host. We're starting at the right, so we start at 1. Remember, it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 1, 2, 8, and we only add together those that are marked with a 1 within this host portion. It's very important to note here, before we go any further and give you the last available host address within this network, a simple rule. Okay, that rule is that we're not allowed to use all zeros, and we're not allowed to use all ones. Now, the all zeros is the network address, as we see here, and the all ones is considered a broadcast address for that network. Now, you don't have to worry about the broadcast currently at the moment, because we're going to examine that as we go further. So because we've got to obey the rules stated above, this would mean that our last available host address in this 192.168.1.0 network would have to be 192.168.1.254. Now, if we have a look at this in binary, we'll understand why this is the last available host address. So we have our network, and we have our last available host. If we minus the 1 off 255, which is what this last bit would signify, we end up with 254. So if we add together these 7 bits, we have 254. We can't have all ones. We've already stated that, because that then becomes the broadcast address for this particular network. So we have an address range on this network of 1 through to 254. So, what's the major downside that we have to classful networking? Well, let's use our previous slide example, which gave us a network of 192.168.1.0/24. That allowed us to have 254 host addresses. But what if we actually only require 10 addresses for host usage? That's even if we take into account future requirements for hosts. It's a complete and utter waste of address space that we may require somewhere else. So, as we state here, it's a waste of valuable address space for hosts. So, what we can actually do is we can consider further subnetting by borrowing bits from the last byte. So, we're going to have a look at how we do this by still taking our network address of 192.168.1.0. Now, in binary, we know that's 24 bits that we're masking. So the subnet would look as follows, as we've always stated: 11111111, followed by again 8 ones, 8 ones, and 8 zeros. And as we know from the zeros perspective, that's the host section, that gives us 254 hosts. So we borrow bits from the last byte by starting at the left and working to the right of the 8 bits in the last byte. So what we're going to do now is we'll show you how we have borrowed 2 bits from the last 8 bits to extend our networks. So the network portion now has an extra 2 bits, as we can see here. And what this means is that we have more networks available, but we'll have less hosts per network. So we're actually starting to save on address space wastage. We must also remember that our subnet also changes. We have borrowed 2 bits, so for the last byte we need to add together the last 2 bits that we borrowed. Those 2 bits are 64 and 128, which equal 192. So we now write the subnet mask as 255.255.255.192, or we can use the /26 for the 26 bits we are now masking. So if we continue with our new subnet of 255.255.255.192, how do we work out what the actual new networks are, or the subnets, and the hosts that are available within those subnets? Well, we've got to go back to binary again to show you this. So what we're going to do here, though, is we're just going to have a look at the last 8 bits, or the last byte, because we already know that the first 3 bytes, or 24 bits, are masked off, and we're just borrowing from the last byte. So we've borrowed 128 and 64, the first 2 bits of the last 8 bits. That means these first 2 parts are the network, and that'll be highlighted in green as we do this now. The zeros are the host portion. So to work out what our new networks are, we simply take the lowest network bit, which will always be the furthest borrowed bit to the right, or the last one. In other words, in this case, the 64. And we simply add that same number again for our networks. So what it would actually be is network 1 would be 0, because it would be without the borrowed bits. But then we turn the first bit on and it becomes 64. If we turn that off and the next bit on, it becomes 128. And we're going to see this in action, but you'll note that that is going up in 64s. So let's have a look at this so that we understand it better. So we have our first host for the first network, and we know the network is going to be 192.168.1, so the first host is going to be 1. So our first subnet would be the original of 192.168.1.0, and our first host would be 192.168.1.1. Now our last host would be 192.168.1.0. 192.168.1.62. And the reason for this is simply because if we add all this host portion together, but minus the one off for the broadcast address because we can't use that, we know that the last host is always going to be 2 below the next network. The next network in this case we know is going to be 64. So if we minus 2 off of that, we get 62. And that's it. So we move on now to the second network, and we'll notice that our second subnet would be 192.168.1.64. This is our next new network address. And our first host within that would be 65. Why? Because if we add 64 and 1 together, we get 65. And our last host would be, if we know that next network is 128 and we minus 2 off of that, well, the last host is going to be 126. So if we add all these together but leave that 1 empty, it'll come to 62. And if we look at our third subnet, it would be 192.168.1.128 because we turn this bit off and this bit on. And our first host would be 192.168.1.129 because we add the 128 and the 1 together and we get 129. And our last host would be 129.168.1.190 because we know if we add 64 to 128, we're going to get 192, which will be our next network. Minus 2 off of it and we get 190. So our fourth subnet would be 192.168.1.192 because we turn on the 2 bits and we add these together and we get 192. Our first host is going to be 193. We add these 3 together and that's what we get. And our last host would be 192.168.1.254. And the reason it would be 254 is if we keep the 1 out of it, because that would create the broadcast, and we add these together and we take the next, what would be, if it went that high, if we were to add 64 again, we would end up with 256, but we take away the 2 and we end up with 254. Now, what we're going to do is on the next slide, we're going to borrow more bits. So we'll borrow up to the 16 so that we can solidify the knowledge that we have gained in this section. So we're going to run through it again, and we're going to run through how we get our first and last host addresses again. So let's solidify our understanding of this. So we're going to borrow 4 bits from the last 8 bits or 4th byte and show you how we work out the networks and the hosts for the networks again, so that we can, as I've mentioned, solidify that understanding. So let's get the actual subnet mask up first and work that out. So we know that this is now the borrowed bits from left to right. So this is the network portion of the last 8 bits, and this is the host portion, and that would be written as 255.255.240, because if we add 128, 64, 32 and 16, it comes to 240, or /28, because that's how many bits we're using for the network. So what's our first network? Well, we know our first network is going to be 192.168.1.0. Okay, but we've got to remember that these 4 bits here are masked for the subnet. So we only have the last 4 bits for the hosts. So our first host is going to be 192.168.1.1. And our last host now, because remember what I said, the last 1 to the right, or the lowest number, is going to be our first subnet, and it's going to go up incrementally in those values. So each network is going to be 16 above the network before. So if we take the next network as being 16 or starting at 16, then we know that we minus 2 off and we get 14 as the last host. This will become more understandable as we go through this. So our next network is going to be our second network available in that subnet 240 subnet mask is going to be 16. And our first host is going to be 17 in that network, and that's because we've switched the first bit on. If we take the next network, we know that it's going to be the next 16 up, so it starts 32, and we know that because it's the next bit that's switched on. Okay, so this is our third network, so our first host is going to be 32 plus 1 is 33. And our last host, if we know that the next network is plus 16 again onto 32, then we know it's 48. So if we minus 2 off of that, our last host has got to be 46. And if we switch this one off and turned these 4 on and added those bits together, we would see it would come to 46. Our fourth network, we now turn on these 2 bits, so it becomes 32 plus 16. So you can see now how it's going up in 16s. We started at 0, we went to 16, we went to 32, now we're on 48. So that's our fourth network, it starts at 48. Our first host is going to be 49, we add that together and it becomes 49. And our last host address is 62, because if we add another 16 to 48, we get 64. Minus 2 off of that, 62. Our fifth network, as we've just mentioned, is 64. We turn on this bit, we turn off the other 2. And our first host is going to be 65, 64 plus 1. And our last host, well, our next network is going to be 64 plus 16 is 74 is 80. So if we minus 2 off of that, our last host has got to be 78. So let's move on to our next network. So our sixth network is 192.168.180 because we turn on the 64. Well, the 64 is already on and we turn on the next 16. Which gives us 80. So our first host is 81. Add those 3 together and we get 81. And our last host address is 94, because if we add 16 to 80, we get 96. So if we minus 2 off of that, we know it's going to be 94. So what's our seventh network? Well, our seventh network is we turn on the next bit up. So 64 plus 32 is 96. That's another 16. And that's our seventh network is 192.168.1.96. Our first host, therefore, is 97 if we add those 3 together. And our last host address is 192.168.1.110 in this network. Because we know that 96 plus 16 is going to come out at 112. Minus 2 off of it, and it's 110. Now, before I give you the very simple method on the next slide of working this out and the rest of the networks and how we work out the hosts, see if you can finish this yourself, the rest of the networks, within this 240 subnet mask, and we'll see if you're correct on the next slide. So let's have a look at all the available networks that we have with a /28 or a 255.255.255.240 network mask. So we start at 00 or all zeros and we get the 192.168.1.0 network. Then we get the 192.168.1.16 network. Then we get the 32 network. Then we get the 48 network. Then we get the 64 network. You notice it's going up in 16s. As I said, you start at the right-hand side of the ones with the lowest number, and that's how the networks will increment. So the next one is 80, then 96, then 112, then 128, then 144, 160, 176, 192, 208, and 224. So here's the quick, easy method for knowing how many networks and how many hosts per network we can have. So we have 4 bits. I've put a space in between to show it a little bit clearer. We have 4 bits for networks and we have 4 bits for the hosts. So this is actually quite an easy one because the calculation is going to be the same for both. So for the networks, we take how many ones we have. In this case, we have 4. And we start at 2 and we double the number for each one that we have. So let's look at the result and what I mean. So if we start at 2, we do 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. See, we're doubling the number each time. So 2, 4, 8, 16. Okay. Now, we can't have all zeros. We know that. We said that earlier in the lesson because that's the network. And we can't have all ones because that's the broadcast. So we know that we have 14 networks. Now, if we were to look at the above with the way the bits are done, that we've just looked at to see what networks are available, if we were to leave out the all zeros, the reason that's in there is because Cisco and Juniper allow us to have that now. But how many is there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, now if we were to do this for the hosts, as I've said, we've got 4 bits for the hosts as well. So we would have 2, 4, 8, 16 minus 2 gives us 14 hosts. So on the next slide, we'll have a quick look at a couple more variations of this so that you understand it a little bit better and how easy it is to work it out, and the starting address, the ending address, and the networks. And that's going to be a quick recap as well. And then that'll be the end of this Classful subnetting lesson. So let's do a quick recap and test. So this time we're going to have a look at a /29, which means we are borrowing 5 bits because we know the first 24 bits are already masked. So this will be our network, will be 111111. Sorry, not our network, but our subnet mask. So we'll have 5 bits for the networks and 3 bits for the hosts. So our subnet mask is going to be 255.255.255.248 or a /29 as we've already stated above. So if we use our calculations, we have 5 borrowed bits, so therefore 5 ones for networks. So if we start at 2, as we've said before, and we use our calculation, we could go 2 for the first one, 4, we double it again, 8, we double it again, 16, we double it again, 32. But we can't have zeros or ones, so we then minus 2 off of that, and we have 30 available networks. Now, if you were to actually write that out in binary as per the last slide, you would get exactly 30 networks. So now let's have a look at the host section. You remember what I said, the more networks we can have, or the more networks we have, the less hosts per network we can have. And we'll see that now. So we only have 3 zeros this time for hosts. So let's use the same calculation. Start at 2, double it, 4, double it again, 8, minus 2 gives us 6 hosts per network. So using the formula that I've given you, working out the networks, remember taking the last one or the lowest number. So in this case, the lowest number would be 8. So all the networks are going to go up in 8s. Okay. So it should actually be quite easy. And because you know the networks, then working out the first and last host in the network should also be easy, because if the first network is 8, then the next one is 16. So we know the first host will be 9, so it'll be the network plus 1. And the next network minus 2 will be the last host, so we know it's 1. And if the next network is 16, then it's 14. It's as simple as that. Bearing that in mind, what I want to do is see if you have a firm understanding, and write me in the comments the answers to the following. If you have a /27 mask, how many networks would you have and how many hosts per network? If you have an IPv4 address of 192.168.1.35 with a /28 mask, what would be the network address for this host? Also, using the same IPv4 address that we've used in question 2, what would be the broadcast address for the network? So this is the conclusion for this subnetworking classful addressing. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, but if you do have any questions, which you may well have because it's not an easy subject to learn, then please let me know in the comments, as well as the answers to the questions, of course, because I look forward to those. Also, if you've enjoyed this tutorial video, then please hit the subscribe button. It would be great to see more of you. And of course, if you do hit the subscribe button, you get to see the next lesson, which will be the classless network addressing lesson. Until then, have a great day, and thank you for watching.